This is expanding your business into the United States, all about L-1 visas. So thank you so much for coming today. And I'll turn it over to Rebecca. All right, so take us away, Rebecca.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining our presentation today. I have a few housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording link will be made available to you via email. This presentation is an educational service by Alcorn Immigration Law, and the information discussed should not be construed as legal advice for any specific action and is an overview only. Please be sure to consult a knowledgeable professional for assistance with your particular issue. Lastly, please submit any questions you may have by using Zoom's Q&A function below, and do so anonymously. These questions are shared publicly, so please do not share any sensitive or personal information. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to our founder and CEO, Sophie Alcorn, and our Chief Legal Officer of Excellence, Lynda Hagerty.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. My name is Sophie Alcorn. I'm the founder of Alcorn Immigration Law, and I am here with my amazing colleague, Lynda Hagerty today. She's our Chief Legal Officer at Alcorn, and we're excited to tell everybody about L1s and how to use them. Thanks for joining me, Lynda.
Thanks for having me, Sophie.
We have a lot of material to cover, but to get started, we'll tell you a little bit about our team and we'll give you an overview of this session today. As Rebecca mentioned, this is being recorded, so you will get a copy in your email to listen to. But by way of introduction, we are leading L1s as well as other types of visas and green cards at Alcorn Immigration Law. We are a business immigration law firm focusing on early stage, rapidly scaling technology companies and startup founders who want to get visas and green cards for themselves and their teams to come to the United States and expand their operations in the US and raise venture capital here. So we're very excited to be here with everybody today. And if you're wondering if this webinar is for you, well, this webinar is for a lot of different types of folks. We have content for startup founders and CEOs, for human resources professionals, people ops at startups, whether you're based in Europe or you're in the United States. Yes, you're in the right place if you're working at a multinational company and you would like to immigrate to the US. Or, if you're just considering for the very first time what it would look like if you wanted to expand your operations to the United States. Perhaps you want a sales and marketing office here, or perhaps you want to bring your engineering team together for your AI company to work faster in real life. Lynda, what are some of the reasons that people are most interested in L visas these days? What are some of the common business factors that are motivating folks that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, we see a lot of entrepreneurs, companies who are established abroad, and they're trying to break into the US market. And so this is a great tool to do that, to transfer an executive or key employees to get the US operations going. There are also companies that we have that are already established, and they want that ability to transfer people between different entities. So it's a wonderful tool. And as you know, Sophie, I'm very fond of L1s.
It's your favorite.
It really is. I don't know why, but I think that they're so useful and you can be really creative with them.
They really are. They really are. We have one company with a blanket L that does a lot of venture investments. So they brought many of their global venture scouts and analysts and VCs to their headquarters, which has been great. We see other companies doing enterprise software where they need folks on the ground, like sales engineers, to court US like Fortune 500 companies. So they need people who intimately know the product here to sell. So there's a lot of reasons, and a lot of like German and French and Italian and UK startups that already raised maybe like a Series A in Europe might feel the need to expand to the US to meet their global metrics so that they can be attractive to US VCs for Series B and beyond. So yeah, lots of different types of reasons. And if any of those apply to you or any other situations, that are remotely related, you're probably in the right place. So thank you so much for joining us today. Some of the personal reasons why folks are interested in this visa is it continues the thing in a startup of tinkering and figuring out how to make something people want. Launching and iterating and product localization is different in different countries, you know, and scaling in Europe where there's a patchwork of companies and languages and cultures is challenging, and it can often be easier to simply have the US be the next market after you've reached scale in your home country. Professionals moving to the US might really value ease of travel and being able to spend time with their teams, both back home and in the US. Maybe they want to still get paid in their home country, but just want to come work here for extended periods of time. So we'll talk about that. Individually, people are interested in advancing their career in the United States and potentially, having access to investors. And then, another really important factor that we'll talk about is folks' families, and making sure that their spouse can come and work, and making sure that their kids can get green cards in time for college, so they don't have to get work visas, if you settle here and make the US your home. So lots of reasons, and we really enjoy counseling our clients to figure out the best strategy and solution that meets their needs with all of the different variables in one's life. So today, this webinar is really going to be talking about visas for founders and executives and leadership teams, also visas for engineers and sales professionals and other types of people with specialized knowledge of the company's product or processes. We're going to talk about how those can expand into green cards, and we're going to talk about bringing family members. And so we'll do visas and green cards, and then we'll share more details on how to reach out to us if you have additional questions. So let's just go into it. Let's talk about the immigration context, Lynda. So how big of a company do you need to qualify? Do you have to be Google or Apple? Like, how can you do this? How big of a company do you need?
Yeah, I mean, there's really no minimum size. So what's nice about the L-1, I mean, you really want to have a strong foreign anchor to tie the US entity to. Or you could start in the US and then have a foreign entity. But typically what we see is a strong foreign entity. Maybe there's 5 to 10 employees, there's revenue, and then the US operations, there could be no employees. You could be the first employee, which is really great.
The US government really cares about not approving people trying to commit fraud by making up fake companies to move to the US. But look, if you're a technology company, a startup, if you have real clients abroad or in the US, if you have customers, if you have revenue, or even angel investment or venture capital, or if you've been in a startup accelerator, that's enough for us to work with. I think what you said, like 5 to 10 employees abroad, is a really good baseline. And then the sky's the limit. So we're happy to help. And okay, great. So a lot of people, including early stage tech startups, can qualify. So that's great. So if somebody is thinking about coming to the US for themselves, what's a visa? What's a green card? And do you have to get a visa to get a green card?
No, I mean, there's different pathways. So like looking at the L-1, that's a non-immigrant work visa category. So that lets you come in and work temporarily for a US company. And if you want to stay long-term, then the next step would be a green card. And that would give you flexibility to work for multiple companies, change employers, whatever it is. And then the last phase is citizenship. And then you can vote in the US, you can live in the US part-time, you have a lot more flexibility, but then you also have to consider taxes.
Okay, great. And then, if you ever really want a US passport to become a citizen, then you have to have a green card first. So that's how that works. Okay. And let's talk a little bit, because I think a lot of executives considering the L-1 visa have probably visited the US before. Maybe they had ESTA, maybe they had a B1, B2 visa. Can you kind of talk about what those are and then how they're different from an L-1 visa?
Yeah, so the B1 business visitor visa, which pairs with ESTA. So essentially the B1 visitor is someone who's coming to the US to, attend meetings, meet with investors, not do productive work, but really put the feelers out for their business activities. That's very common. ESTA is for certain countries that qualify for an exemption from the visa sticker requirement. So they can come in just like a business visitor. They only get admitted for 90 days, but same thing, it's very temporary. You're not doing productive work in the US. We see a lot of folks that do that when they're trying to get their company off the ground and start their US startup.
Yeah. How far can you get on ESTA or B1, B2? And then when should you really look at an L1?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I always talk about like the pattern and duration of travel. So if you find yourself in the US for extended periods of time as you're coming in under ESTA or B1, you're going to raise eyebrows. And CBP does have discretion. We can prep people for how to be interviewed, but at the end of the day, they could simply just deny an admission. So I think if you really need to be in the US, at some point you do have to pivot to a work visa like the L1 so that you don't get that door shut on you as you've crossed the Atlantic Ocean in 8 hours in a plane and then head back home because they think that you're here to do something more than attend business meetings or
Yeah. So if like you've ever been put in secondary inspections at the airport, you should probably get a work visa ASAP. If they've started to ask you more questions because you're traveling a lot, you should definitely consider getting a work visa. And can you talk about this? And we might come back to this later, but if you're not ready to go on payroll in the United States yet, that's okay as well, right?
With the L1, yeah. So you can be an intermittent L. So there's a possibility to spend, if you spend less than, well, L's in general, they can be on the US or foreign payroll. So that's just a special exception for the visa category. But people use the L as a tool just to come back and forth so they don't have to deal with secondary inspection and other questions. You're still on the foreign payroll, but you can just come freely to the US.
And you could also be pursuing a green card for yourself and your family the whole time. So like, if you know that you're going to move your family here in 3 years when your kids are in high school, but you don't want to uproot them while you're still traveling a bunch on a visa, you could get an L1, you could still live in your home country, you could still get paid in your home country, you could still be putting your family through a green card process. And you can just keep coming in and out freely. And then you don't have to limit your business trips to 90 days or 6 months. I mean, in that situation, you probably want to go back home and see your family more, but you can come in and out frequently and you could spend the majority of your time here and your travel would be totally compatible with that. They would not stop you at the airport for anything. They're like, oh, welcome. Oh, you were just here 3 days ago and you're trying to get a green card and you might stay for 80 days on this trip. Welcome, and just change it as much as you need to.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about always getting a return ticket if you don't know when you want to depart. So there's more flexibility there. Great. Okay. So let's go more into the L1 in depth. So we've already alluded to several of these things, but walk us through these L1 benefits, please.
Yeah. So, the first one we've touched on, I think it's a really important one, is that you can pursue a green card and it's not going to restrict your ability to travel on the L. There's never going to be any issues. So you have a lot of flexibility. I think the second one is actually very important as well. The spouse can be immediately work authorized when they activate their L2 status. So once they come in, they don't have to apply for work card and they can work for any employer. They can even work for the US startup. I mean, we see that a lot. They got to get the company off the ground and there's someone who can work immediately.
Yeah, so that's amazing. That's very rare. If you're considering a bunch of different visa types for some employee, for example, and their spouse being able to work is a really important factor for their personal immigration. Like spouses of O1 visa holders for extraordinary ability, they don't get to work automatically. H-1B spouses at first don't get to work automatically. So this is a real privilege for the L visa that our government basically said, look, we value you executives so much and people with specialized knowledge. you're such a high priority that even though your spouse's job might take away a job from an American, we're willing to let your spouse work automatically. That you don't even have to apply for that card. You can just do it immediately. So that's fabulous, especially if your spouse is a startup founder or self-employed or just wants to get a job at a US company, but maybe US companies aren't going to sponsor visas for that type of job role. This is a huge advantage.
It is definitely. And I mean, I think another really big advantage is if you're a qualifying L1 manager and executive, meaning you've worked abroad in a managerial or executive role for a related entity, when you transfer to the US, you have this option of doing this fast track green card and you fall under the first employment preference.
So this is as fast. This is basically as fast as an EB-1A for extraordinary ability, right?
Yeah, and they allow premium processing now for it too. So
yeah.
It's a great tool.
You don't have to be a famous Einstein genius to get first preference employment-based green card. So if you're from India or China, this is really, really important for you. It's a really great option. Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes we have people that are strategizing, right? Like you're working in the US, you go to India, go to whatever country it is, work for a year, and then you come back.
Yeah.
And you've got the green card pathway. The other thing is salary. You know, when we look at H-1Bs and other similar categories like the E3, we've got a prevailing wage requirement. There's no wage scrutiny here. And it's wonderful. And you can also be paid on the foreign payroll. So there's a ton of flexibility.
And then what about the last point? This matters a lot for founders. Is there any maximum amount of equity that you could hold in your startup to still qualify for an L1?
No, there's no maximum. Yeah, there's no limits. You can sometimes get questions from USCIS about, do you intend to return home? It doesn't mean you can't apply for a green card, but they want to know that even though that you're not using your ownership to get a green card. So we navigate through that with you, but generally speaking, you can have ownership and there's not an issue.
Yeah, it's really great. So there's a lot of benefits, which is why we're doing a whole webinar on this. Okay, so core requirements, I'll take the first part. Super simple. You need 2 companies, one in the US that's been opened, like a Delaware C corporation or a New York wholly owned subsidiary, or a California LLC or Wyoming LLC. It really doesn't matter what state or if it's an LLC or a corporation. And you need a foreign company, and they both have to have common ownership and control. So you can have one parent, one subsidiary, or flip which is which, or they could be branches or affiliates. So you got these 2 companies, and then you're basically transferring somebody who worked in the abroad company for at least 1 year out of the last 3 years as an employee, ideally, to the US office to work for the US entity. So can you talk about what the doing business requirement is, please?
Yeah. So when we do an L1, a traditional L1, we have to be able to demonstrate that there's sufficient business activity, meaning the company is operating, even if it's not generating revenue, there's contract for services, there's payroll, there's an office space, there's just regular business activity. The foreign entity has to have that for at least 12 months. We can use bank statements. I mean, everybody's situation is unique. We have a laundry list, and we, cherry pick the ones that are best suited to our clients to help build the case.
Does it matter? So if somebody is a really early stage startup, can they use any of the pre-incorporation activities to prove this, or does it have to be after the legal entity is formed?
It has to be after the legal entity is formed. Yeah, so that's sort of the line in the sand that they draw. But what is nice is if you have a company that's a startup in the US, you've got an established foreign company, there is a new office L. So this is a gift in some ways for startups.
So let's say we've got a UK startup that's raised Series A, and they have 10 employees, and now they're looking at creating a wholly owned Delaware C Corp subsidiary to raise venture capital, and then eventually do a Delaware flip and have the US entity become the parent company of the UK entity, and transfer all the angel investors and Series A investors to the cap table of the US. And they really need the CEO to, come to the US immediately to meet with the VCs and start getting sales in the US. So it's a brand new US company. But let's say the London office has been around for 2 years and the founder's been on payroll for the last 18 months. So what is the new office situation, and what could the founder be able to do in the US in that situation where they just started the US Delaware C company?
Yeah, so it's sort of like a special carve out under the L1 category for US businesses that haven't been doing business for a full year. It really allows an executive or manager to come into the US and get the operations going in the US. There are a few requirements that they do tag on. Like one really important one is there has to be a physical office space in the US. I know in this virtual world, it seems ridiculous. And if it's just one person, but at the same time, it is important. The other thing, if we want to have a business plan showing like what the goals are of the company, what sort of revenue projections there are, staffing. And if you're, say, I want to hire 10 people in the US, then you've got to think about having an office that might be able to accommodate 10 people. So we definitely strategize both of those things with our clients. But executives or managers in that first year, they can do more administrative work. Like the L1 is typically very strict with managers and executives, but this is the one time that they give you a pass. They say, you're one and only coming over. We know that you're not going to have people doing work under you. So you have more flexibility in the actual job that you'll be doing in that first year.
And ideally, after the first year, we'll just be able to get that manager or or executive the full 2-year incremental extensions up to 7 years on an L-1A. But look, if things go a little bit slower than planned, we could potentially ask for a second 1-year new office L1 if we had to. So there's different ways to work with that. But it's really nice that you can come here to set up a brand new office.
Yeah, it's a great tool.
On this slide, before we move ahead, is there any, because this I think stumps people, so I just want to clear up any misconceptions. There's another visa that we're not focusing on today that's called an E2 investor visa, and we typically recommend investment of like $60,000 to $250,000 for that into the new US company before the investor comes over and gets their visa. How much capital is required in a new office L1? Like, does the bank account need money? Do they have to spend any required amount of money first? Or like, what's a good rule of thumb?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we can be really creative. So you can show that the parent company has a strong revenue stream and get a letter saying they're going to basically support the US entity. We want to show some money in the bank, whether it's 50,000. There isn't necessarily a magic number because we have to kind of look at everything holistically and help paint that picture. But I do like to see some money in a US bank account just to get operations going. So 50,000 might be a good threshold, but again, it could be less if the foreign entity was more established and had more funding.
Yeah. And another difference, I think, is the E2 requires you to spend all the money first, but with an L1, we just want to show there's access to capital if needed to execute the business plan. So you don't actually have to go spend all of it already. So that's really nice too.
Yeah.
We did get our first question, and I think it's appropriate to answer it here. This is about the physical office space requirement for the new office L1s. And the question is, how much is enough? So is a hot desk at a WeWork okay if you just have a membership and you can show up to any location anytime?
Yeah, I mean, our preference is that
Yes.
you have, I'm gonna use your line, Sophie, 4 walls and a door. Like, right, and it's more legitimate. But I will say I have been creative and been able to say, look, we only have an office space for one person, but we have an agreement that we can expand and show that you have access to 10 more spaces, so if you can only secure that one dedicated space, we can work with you to show that there's more space readily available.
And very rarely over the years, I've seen site visits with government investigators to confirm that it's a real company. And not so much with startups, but sometimes early stage startups look suspicious just because you have 0 employees and $5 million sitting in the bank account. I'm like, where did this money come from? So if some officer doesn't know what a startup is, it could look fishy. But in those times where I've been exposed to that site visit concept, in an ideal world, the person would show up at a brick building with a sign on the street and a parking lot, and that was just your company, and they would go inside and there'd be a receptionist who would greet them, and you would have all of your, compliance records at the front desk, and there'd be a hive of people working. Like, that's, I think, what the government thinks of as a real business. So keeping that in mind and working backwards, the four walls and a door concept, if you're in a WeWork, it would be, and because they could ask for pictures too, right? So ideally, it's a dedicated space. There's like stuff on the wall. Your company's name is on the door. If somebody shows up at the front desk and there's a receptionist, they're like, oh, nobody's in right now, but they're in suite 221. So, would you like a tour of the office? And they can like go and look in and see all of your stuff by your computers. We want you to have like a real office that you're using. And I think people are getting more sick of working from home sometimes. So I think that's a little bit easier for people to palate than it was in like 2021 when the requirements seemed utterly ridiculous. But some people like working in real life now. So hopefully that works for you. But if you're coming to the US for some reason, it's probably to meet people in person. So you're probably going to have a need for a space of one type or another. And so, okay, so what are the three types of L1 visas and how much time do you get on an L1?
Yeah, I mean, so when we look at the L1, it really breaks up between the L-1A and the L-1B. And the L-1A is kind of broadly referred to as manager, L-1A manager, but it really encompasses like three subcategories. You could be a people manager, meaning you have professional direct reports. You could be a function manager, meaning you're managing an essential function of the organization, and maybe you have support of cross-functional team members to execute tasks. And then executive is, exactly what it sounds like. You're at a C-suite level, you're a CEO, you're running the company. Those are really the three types that we gravitate to, and there are permitted. Typically, a people manager or executive are going to be easier than a function manager. It's harder to document.
Yeah, and maybe a function manager would be like a CPA managing all of the finances of a company is like a one person, but they're responsible for, or I guess like a CFO with no direct reports or something in charge of all the finances for a company. Maybe like a highly technical role in charge of a whole branch of things. But yeah, it's easier usually with just an org chart with a reporting structure. And
it is like I've done product managers, right? So they're in charge of the marketing, the engineering team, but they don't have the people reporting to them, but you have to show that those people draw into them. So it's a lot of documentation. I've done it, but it's pretty heavy in terms of documenting.
Yeah. And sometimes for this, they really go into it where they're like, well, show me your entire org chart. Show me every employee, show me every college they went to, show me every person's job duties that's reporting to this person. So it can feel like a lot of information sometimes, but we just have to clearly be able to tell the story of how you're managing people or functions.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, I always tell people it's almost like you're a teenager, like you have to prove it. Right. You can't just say it, they don't believe you. Like, show me, okay, you have meetings with your direct reports. Let's get copies of the calendar invites. Yeah. So there's a lot that can go into it, but we walk you through it and we try to make it as easy as possible.
Yeah. And the benefits to being able to show that you're a manager or an executive are, and this will become clear in the next slide, but you get 7 years total instead of 5 years total. If it's a new office L1, it would be 1 + 2 + 2 + 2 = 7. So just a different ratio of number of visas and increments, but the extensions are always 2 years. And there is a fast track EB1 pathway to a green card for managers and executives, which we'll talk about a little bit later that we alluded to at the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about recapture and intermittent?
Sure. Yeah, so that 7-year timeline for L-1As is the max amount of time they can be physically in the US. So if they're traveling on a regular basis, you can technically recapture that time. So there is a place on the application form where you show periods of stay in the US, so you can buy back that time. So if you need to keep extending your L1, just keep very good travel records and we can help you do that. And then there's the more extreme case where you're spending less than half of your time in the US. So some people, they're really just coming to touch down in the US for 4 or 5 trips a year for a few weeks at a time. They're not based in the US, they're still based abroad. They want that freedom of coming in on the L. If you're spending less than half of your time in the US and you can document it, then you're not subject to any time limit. So that you can just keep extending indefinitely as long as you're meeting that 50% standard.
And that might be a situation where you want to check things with your cross-border tax advisor, because there might be advantages where you don't necessarily have to do US income tax reporting in the US. If you're just only spending a minority of your time here, and for example, you're getting paid in Europe and you're just coming in for business trips, even if you have an L-1. So there could be like tax advantages as well, but we're not tax advisors. Please, I can refer you to some good global mobility tax advisors if you need it. Okay, so in contrast, what is the L-1B and what are the main differences?
Yeah, so the L-1B is another category for what we call specialized knowledge workers. So it's someone who's coming here typically in a technical capacity, or they have unique or specialized knowledge of the company's products or services, and that knowledge is needed in the US.
And this confused me so much when I still remember, like, I was just having a flashback to being like my face red with embarrassment when I was a brand new immigration lawyer. And I thought that specialty occupation from H-1B was the same thing as specialized knowledge from L-1B. And I learned that I was saying the wrong thing and I was so ashamed. But it's it sounds like it has special in it. But the H-1B rules are very different from the L-1B rules. So it's 5 years, and I guess we've already determined you're not managing people or a function, and that's why we're looking at this category. Broad for a year, and you're coming here to do a job. What are some examples of this specialized knowledge requirement, advanced or specialized knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, for a technical person, I would say if somebody maybe was a co-developer on a software product or application, and they are the ones who developed it for the foreign entity, and now you're going to launch this product in the US and you need to train teams on how to use it, that would be kind of a very clear-cut L1. I mean, we can do it with marketing people, we can do it with other people, but
I've done it with
technical
sales engineers who have some very niche knowledge where they need to go to like US customer site visits at companies for enterprise software and explain it or implement it.
Right.
Yeah.
And we did something similar recently for someone. And I would say like you just have to look at how is that person an expert? How did they get that knowledge? And why do you need them in the US?
We do so much with software, but probably in the olden days or for other industries that involve more manufacturing, I could see a lot more jobs qualifying for specialized knowledge in a factory setting where you're physically creating something, programming the machines, producing something, moving physical things, installing them. That would be pretty clear cut as well, right?
Yeah, I agree. But I mean, even in business, I've done it for like accountants type roles, where it's so you can be creative. Even I've done it for HR people. They know their internal like HR system, right? And they're going to adapt it in the US. So we help you to create a story, but we definitely need the client's input. Oftentimes I have a call and I have like an aha moment. Okay, because people are modest. They don't know that what they do is exceptional or unique. I'm just doing my job. So we have to try to figure out what the best angle is.
So true. To the extent you can prep any of your employees to brief us on the jobs by thinking about why are they irreplaceable? Why is it going to be difficult to train an American to just do this? Like, what is it about what they know that makes them unique? That's really helpful for us to think about how we can do legal arguments. Okay, and let's talk about how to file Canadians blankets, and then I know we have a question about visa consular processing, so we'll get to that in there as well. So, okay, what is the general filing process?
So a standard L1 would be filed with USCIS. And then, you have the option to file through premium processing, which is 15-day processing. And then after USCIS approval, the next step is to get a visa stamp at the embassy. And then you can come in to activate the L-1. That's sort of the traditional path.
So unlike an E-2, you don't just apply directly at the consulate. There's always got to be some sort of paperwork, whether it's your own or a blanket L, but USCIS is going to bless this at some point in the process, unless you're Canadian, right?
Hey, yes.
So what happens if you're Canadian?
Yeah, so if you're a Canadian, you're lucky because the L-1 is significantly easier. Essentially, you can process it at the US-Canadian border, and you do it with US Customs. So you could go through like a major Canadian airport. There's pre-clearance US Customs there, or you could do it at a border, port of entry. But essentially, you are being interviewed and applying for the L-1. You don't require a visa stamp in your passport. So it's really just an interview, and then USCIS will follow up with an approval notice in the mail, 3 or 4 months later.
Okay, great. And so, how long does the process overall take, if you're Canadian?
Well, it could be same-day processing. I mean, we need time to prepare the application, but it's exceptionally fast, especially if you go to an airport, because they do have to accept you on the same day. But if you try to go to a land border, sometimes they require you have an appointment in advance. So you do have to investigate that.
Okay. Okay, great. If anybody's Canadian and wants more details, put it in the Q&A panel and we'll circle back to this. I do know that we have some interest in blanket L1s. So walk us through what that is.
Yeah, so this is essentially a tool for established companies that have multiple entities. They have to have at least 3 entities they have to have a US entity and then a total of 3 entities, foreign branches, subsidiaries, affiliates, parent company, in order to meet some of the baseline requirements. The other pieces, it's essentially a way to transfer people in and skip the USCIS processing. So when you get a blanket approval, what happens is USCIS pre-approves the relationship between your US company and the foreign entities. And then when the individuals are seeking L status that want to come into the US and transfer, they simply go into a US embassy or consulate like a visa appointment, except they are interviewed and they get issued a visa stamp, but they have to go through an interview process, which is a little bit more than a typical interview, but generally a lot less scrutiny than USCIS.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really great for our companies that can get to this stage. Absolutely. And then what is the extension process like?
Yeah, so if you're in the US and you're traditional L1, then you'd file that with USCIS. You can work while the extension is pending, even if your status is expired, as long as you filed it before you expired. But if you travel, you have to go and make sure you have a valid visa stamp to come back into the US.
Great. And I think this is going to be a good point to circle back to some of the questions that we have so far before we get into green cards. So here's a question, which is kind of comparing, I think, so I'll just paint a scenario, and I don't know who this individual is or if this is accurate, but I'll just give it more, I'll flesh it out to make it more real for everybody. Let's say you have a startup in India and it has 40 people working there, and it's actually like a Delaware C corporation as the parent company. And you've been successful in selling your product to US companies, and now it's time to bring over some of the founders and some of the key folks to have an on-the-ground presence and raise money for the next round. So you have all these people in India who could get L1s. It's a new US office, and you're thinking about, whether to put people in the H-1B lottery or whether to start doing L1s to eventually qualify for a blanket L1. And we know that India has a lot more visa scrutiny at consulates than like Denmark, for example. How would you counsel the executives of that company to start thinking about H-1Bs with the lottery, H-1Bs without the lottery through workarounds, L1s building up to a blanket L1? Like, what's easiest if you qualify?
Well, when we look at when we're talking about L strictly, I like to think of the blanket L and the US CBP for Canadians as kind of at a similar level, where it's probably you provide half the documentation than you would for USCIS filing. So you really pare it down. So instead of a 20-page business plan for a new office L, you would put in a 2-page summary of a business plan for in this case, it would be a border L for Canadians. So I typically don't worry about the interview, because one of the services that we do for our blanket Ls is we have a call with you. We go through the application. We kind of tell you what to expect for questions. We give you the buzzwords that the embassy is looking to hear. And those cases are pretty, India, there can be more scrutiny, but we're just more prepared.
Yeah. And I think in India too, there's a lot of technology consulting companies that move a lot of IT engineers to the US, and they are choosing between H-1Bs and L-1s. And I think for those companies, both H-1Bs and L-1s get a lot of scrutiny because those companies get a lot of scrutiny.
Yeah.
But if it's like a funded tech startup that's choosing, maybe for your first 5 executives, it might be better to start with an L1 than an H1B, just because there's no lottery and you can establish a good track record of, solid qualifying executives for the company. And then probably switching to a blanket L as soon as you qualify, either with 10 L1 approvals in the past 10 months, 12 months, or $25 million of US annual sales, or having 1,000 US employee, you're probably going to hit 25 million or 10 approvals before you hit 1,000 US employees. So targeting getting the blanket L is probably a good strategy. But if you need to move a bunch of US engineers over, then maybe consider the H-1B with the lottery and cap exempt concurrent H-1Bs as a backup. So I think it really depends.
Yeah, and I also think between the L-1A and the L-1B, one consideration is like H-1Bs, if you're in the green card process, you can keep extending your time. So there's a 6-year maximum, but if you reach green card milestones, you can keep extending. And there is a long green card backlog. So if you're an Indian national and you're coming in on an L-1B, you just have 5 years and there isn't a way to extend that. So a lot of times we'll want to convert you over to an H-1B so that if you have to go through the traditional green card pathway, you can keep extending the H-1B within a time maximum.
And okay, let's take these other questions. These are very technical. I think we can answer these pretty briefly about how we do our best practices on these cases. So I think this is maybe for somebody who's already, in the process, for example. But when we send the package to USCIS, we aren't currently using the credit card form because we find it's too unreliable and hard to track. So we always use paper checks from our trust accounts. We hold our client funds in escrow until we're ready to file. And we send everything with tracking, whether it's FedEx or UPS or the US Post Office, whatever it is, depending on the speed that's necessary and the destination address, we're going to do a ton of tracking on everything. And then the normal USCIS response after receiving the petition depends on if you've chosen premium processing or not. So typically, if you have an attorney, what is going to happen is if you're using premium processing, your attorney's going to get an email saying, hey, here's your receipt number, your case is in process. And then we also go back and we look at the cash checks to look at for the receipt number so we can double check there. If you don't use premium processing, they're going to be mailing you a physical piece of paper called a receipt notice, and that typically takes 2 to 4 weeks to arrive. I would say usually 3 weeks, and it gets sent to the mailing address on file. And then that's where you have your receipt number and you can start tracking your USCIS case status and the USCIS processing times for your service center. Anything to add onto that, Lynda?
Yeah, I mean, there's a question about that form, the credit card form. So yeah, we don't, as Sophie said, we don't do the credit card. So that is another way to get notification. But you do get an electronic receipt notice. It used to come in 1 to 2 business days, but I will say in the last month or so, it's taking maybe 3 to 4 business days. So that's kind of frustrating.
So there might be a little busy right now.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, then let's go to green cards and then we'll have time for a few more questions if you guys want before we wrap up. So normally in our webinars, if you've been with Alcorn for a while and you're like looking at L-1A and EB-1A and EB-2NW, we're always promoting those because they're great for startup founders and self-employed people and people who don't know if their business is going to implode one day, because you can just self-petition. But the L1 has its own unique green card pathways that we don't typically talk about. So of course you can mix and match from any green card category you want. So if you got an L1 and for whatever reason you still want an EB-1A or an EB-2NW, you can certainly do that. But what are the most common green card pathways for folks in L visas, Lynda?
Yeah, so if you are have been a manager abroad or an executive for at least 1 year prior to coming to the US, 1 year in the past 3 years prior to coming to the US, then that sets you up for this fast track green card, the EB-1C, which is a first employment preference green card. You have to be able to show that you're going to be doing or you are doing managerial or executive work in the US. And essentially, it's like an L-1A, but almost like the comparison of an O1 to an EB-1A. It's just more evidence. You know, it's the same structure of the case, but you really have to build it out more. So typically, I would recommend that someone works here for 6 months in a managerial executive capacity, builds up their US evidence profile, and then we file the EB-1C. And it's just really skipping to the second stage of the green card process, filing the I-140.
And one other nuance, this is super technical, but I've seen it come up for very early stage companies. The US entity has to be doing business for at least 1 year to qualify for the EB-1C. So if you just moved here for a new office L1, you're going to have to wait till after the US company is doing business for 1 year or more to qualify for the EB-1C.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So if it's a new office L, there's an exception. So be mindful of that time, but use that time to your advantage. You know, document everything so we can set it up so that when we're ready to file, you have a lot of evidence to show that you are working in that executive or managerial capacity.
And let's say you're bringing over your like a wonderful engineer and you've got to get them an L-1B and they were born in Greece. What would the typical way be for the US company to sponsor them for a green card?
Yeah, I mean, to get through the perm track green card where we have to do the labor market test, that phase alone can take 18 months to 2 years. So you really want to make sure you start the green card process when they have 3 years left, ideally 2.5 to 3 years, just to make sure you don't have any gap in their work authorization.
So even potentially before the initial L1 has expired.
Yeah.
Basically get them to the US and talk to us about when to start their green card.
Right. Yeah, basically.
Okay. And then you talked about this a little bit before, because we have such large green card backlog times for folks born in India or China. What is the best strategy for them?
Yeah, so you know, the L-1B has 5-year maximum. There isn't a way to extend that. So if you know you're pursuing a green card and you're from a country like India, China, where there's a long backlog, you really have to plan ahead for how you're going to stay in the US in a work authorized status long term. Unfortunately, L-1B just isn't that option. It's going to give you 5 years maximum. But if you're able to convert to H-1B through the lottery, and then once you hit certain green card milestones, you can keep extending that H-1B beyond the 6-year maximum.
Yeah. So for folks on L-1B from India, maybe put them in the H-1B lottery each year and start their perm early and see if you're willing to promote them and do a change from an L-1B to an L-1A to start their EB-1C.
Yeah, I mean, if you convert them over to an L-1A, you can get them the 7 years, but if they didn't work as a manager for 1 full year abroad, then the EB-1C option is not available. I've been creative.
Normally you can mix and match for L-1A and L-1B if you were like an executive or specialized knowledge. But for EB1C, you have to be a manager or executive, both abroad and here. You can't go from specialized knowledge abroad to manager here, right?
Right.
So very technical. People are
It
trying
is.
all sorts of startups to do like volume-based, whatever, immigration at scale. But at the end of the day, there's so many nuances with
Mhm.
such, what you're getting the benefit of decades of expertise in this webinar, everybody. It is quite complex. Yeah, so this sort of shows all the options here. We've mentioned the EB1C, which is very similar to the L-1A for people who are multinational managers and executives abroad. And then for folks on L-1B, companies are often sponsoring them through the perm process for EB2 with an advanced degree or EB3 as a skilled worker. But theoretically, the company could sponsor them for an EB1A for extraordinary ability or EB2 national interest waiver green card. So it just depends on how flexible and open the company is to exploring the best option for their employee. Oh, yes. And this kind of shows you some of the wait times. So, okay, so I guess I'll just preface this. This is a sample of the visa bulletin. It's run by the State Department. It changes every month. It's basically a way, like if you go to a deli and you walk in and you take a number and then there's a display of who's ordering sandwiches and they say now serving number 73 and you're like, oh, I'm number 48. But then all of a sudden you're in the front of the line and you're like, wow, I guess there's like 40 people working here because they just called my number really fast. Or, oh my God, the person, I'm supposed to, they're calling 73, I'm 71, but the person in front of me is trying to order 100 sandwiches. This is going to take forever. So that's sort of how this document works. Like, we don't really know how long it's going to take you, but we can tell you that the folks who are at the front of the line now started their process on this date. So like, if you were born in mainland China and you're able to file for your green card now, you started the process by filing your petition on or before September 1st, 2022. So we don't know how many people have filed and are waiting in line from September 1st, 2022 to the present. It could be 10 million, it could be 5, and depending on how many there are, that's going to determine how long you're going to have to wait. So basically, if you're born in India and you want to do EB2 or EB3, you may have a decades-long wait time. If you're born in Europe, and you're doing EB1, you're at the front of the line. If you're doing EB2, you have a small wait time, essentially. And by small, we mean like maybe an extra year or something. Okay, that's the visa bulletin. Anything else there, Lynda? Or move on?
No, it's just depressing, I think, for some people, but I think the most important thing is get in line, right? Because these dates change month to month and unpredictable things have happened. I remember once all the dates became current. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah.
Crazy things can happen.
Crazy. And now there's people who still don't have green cards who regret not taking advantage of that month-long window when it did happen. So just, if you think you want a green card one day, doing this doesn't even commit you to having permanent residence. You could always start the process and abandon it. If it's important for you to have a spot in line, then at least try starting it soon. Okay, so next step. So we're available for L1s, H1Bs, blanket L1s, EB1Cs, other types of green cards. We charge flat fees for everything. We have an amazing team. Lynda loves L1s. She is the L1 expert. You can always contact us for a complimentary consultation. If you're running human resources at your company, we're going to want your candidate's name and email, and we're going to send them our questionnaire, which is going to ask them for questions like this so that we can explore all their options. You can see the first checkbox is, I want to transfer from a foreign company where I worked at least 1 year out of the last 3 years. So that's our gateway into exploring L1 options for your candidates. And we'll offer any person from a company a complimentary consultation to discuss the options for your team member. And it's your call whether you want to have it just be with us to get all the details first, or whether you want to include the candidate on that initial call. For people who are doing O1A, EB1A, we do have a live prep class. Tomorrow's actually the last day for signups. So that's 7 weeks with me every Thursday from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific time. for 7 more weeks to prep for L-1A, EB-1A, and EB-2 NIW to help me guide you on what type of evidence will help you become qualified if you want one of those options. And if you're also considering, like, should I do EB-1A or EB-1C? I don't know. I don't know how good of an EB-1A case I have. Maybe it's good. We have a 4-week evidence assessment program for EB-1A called Legal Launch, which we can also offer to you. We do have a few more minutes for any final questions, but we do encourage you to reach out to us via email, hello@alcorn.law, or through our contact form on our website, or you can give us a call, and we'd love to help you. And all those links are in the webinar chat as well. And we do have one more question. This is an evidence question, Lynda. Are bank statements needed in addition to the pay stubs? Or maybe we should say, when could it be, what type of company, for which types of companies could it be beneficial to go the extra step of including bank statements?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a smaller company, the bank statements are going to be more important to show that you've got capital in the US and money in the bank to start the US operations. But, you know, there's not one formula. So we go through this and we do like a holistic view of your case, and we go through the evidence list together and decide the best way to present it.
Great, thank you. All right, well, we'd love to help all of you. Please do get in touch with us. And we thank you for participating and listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day. And thank you so much, Lynda, for taking the time and sharing all of your knowledge and expertise with everybody. It's very, very appreciated.
Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.